It was late August and the majority of Europeans were still enjoying the last days of summer when the news broke. Pakistan was hit by a monsoon of unseen strength. A few days later, it became clear that this would result in the biggest humanitarian catastrophe the country had witnessed in the 75 years of its existence. At the same time, Europe's meteorological institutes came to the conclusion that 2022 was the hottest summer ever measured in the EU's history, and one of the driest too. My name is Elizabeth Minkoff, ICMPD Communications Officer, and today we will discuss the topic of climate change and migration. I have the pleasure to welcome Ayesha Qaisrani, ICMPD Research Officer, who also happens to be from Pakistan. She brings in both the research perspective as well as the insight and knowledge into the cause of Pakistan. A very warm welcome, Aisha.
Thank you for having me.
I hope your family in Pakistan is doing okay, and I hope you're doing okay as well, given the severity of the situation. I understand this topic must be very personal to you as well, but nevertheless, I would like to set the scene and sort of look at the facts. It was very difficult for me to find reliable numbers of how many people are actually at the moment affected in Pakistan.
Thank you for asking, and my family is doing okay, thankfully, but just seeing the level of destruction in Pakistan, it hits you emotionally, especially if you're not in the country and you're just observing everything from a distance. In terms of numbers, I agree that they are changing because it's an unfolding situation. Right. Only now the rains have slowed down or stopped, and now we're getting to know the full extent of the destruction. To the best of my knowledge, there are about 33 million people that are affected by the floods. And they're displaced. There are as many as 1,500 people that have lost their lives. 400 of them are children. And over 12,000 people are injured in flood-related events.
So just to also understand the entire situation, how it unfolded, the rain started in June?
Yes, the rain started in June. And that's normally the monsoon season. When it starts, it's late June, maybe early July, lasts until August. But this time around, the rain started early, more intensely, and also in places that were not affected by the monsoon that much in the previous years.
Where did the rainfalls occur, and which are the regions that are now mostly affected?
So rainfalls in the monsoon season, they normally happen in the northwest province, which is Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, and upper Punjab, upper and central Punjab, which is more towards the north of the country or central north of the country. But this time around, the rains also moved down to the south to Sindh province and Balochistan province. And these are flat lands. They don't have a very effective water drainage system. So if there are, if there is water coming to these places, it's really difficult for it to find a way because there are no natural pathways for the water to flow.
Is it usually, are these usually the areas that are also dry?
Yeah, these are arid to semi-arid areas. They are dry. They're in Balochistan, especially, which is the second most hit province from this disaster. There are no major rivers flowing. So all of these were hill torrents that are higher in speed. And of course, there's no natural pathways for the water to flow. That's why the destruction is much higher. And it's not just the water flowing, because when it's flowing from a distance, then it's taking along all the debris and the mud and all the bricks and stuff that the buildings are collapsing. So it hits with more force when it goes down.
Yeah, looking at the picture, it really reminds me of the pictures that we saw from the tsunami catastrophes, in fact. So it's pretty severe.
It is, sorry if I interrupt, it is quite severe because even when I was talking to my grandparents, they were saying that these are the worst floods that they have seen in their entire life. And this is a big statement because Pakistan has had floods before. So this is not the first time that some regions have been affected, but this has been the most intense, the biggest in scale. And that's why it's such a big deal, even for Pakistanis who have experienced floods before. 33 million people is hard for people to understand how much that population is. And I just made some comparisons in relation to the population in Europe, and that's half the population of Italy, half the population of France, and the combined population of Austria, Hungary, and Greece. That's 33 million people for you.
Right. It's very hard to grasp the severity of the situation. Are there now already estimations of first how long it's going to take to rebuild, reconstruct, and what the costs will be, and of course what the current emergency measures are?
So for now, the priority is relief and rescue. Rebuilding and reconstruction comes much later. The estimates say that it would take about 6 months for the water to recede from the places that it has affected. And as I mentioned earlier, most of the places that are most affected are flatlands. So there's absolutely no way for the water to drain anywhere. So trying to build some sort of channels for drainage of water, that is also taking time. At the same time, there is this crisis of people displaced. There are now diseases unfolding because waterborne diseases, even malaria and skin infections that are becoming common. So even saying that 1,500 people have died because of the flood, there are more deaths coming in now later because of all these ensuing cascading effects.
How is the country dealing with it?
It's really difficult. It's a difficult question to answer. There are so many different frontiers in which they have to deal with it, the whole rescue operation, then also providing for the people who are affected, and then finding long-term solutions as well, because as I said, Pakistan, it experiences floods quite often, so it is a poor country in economic terms. So it takes a long time to recover from one episode of floods. And by the time people are getting back to their lives in some ways, the next year comes and there are more rains and more floods. There are estimates that this time around the economic loss alone is around 20 billion. The conservative estimates are $12 billion. The more realistic are $20 billion. And that's a big loss to recover from. Especially in a country that already has high rates of poverty, high rates of unemployment, high inflation rates currently after the COVID pandemic as well. So there's a lot that is going on, and this flood is not the only crisis that Pakistan is facing right now, but it is surely the biggest one.
Looking at the bigger picture and looking at the long-term problems, Pakistan is part of the top 10 countries that are said to be most affected by climate change. Can you elaborate on why this is, or what are the factors? How do they even measure this?
So Pakistan has been among the top 10 countries most affected or most at risk from climate change or climate extreme events. And this index is mostly published annually by this organization called German Watch. And basically what makes Pakistan vulnerable to climate change impacts is its diverse terrain, the geographic terrain. So we have the mountains and glaciers up in the north, about 7,000 glaciers. That is the third biggest reservoir of glaciers outside of the poles. If we go southward, then there is more arid to semi-arid areas, and these areas are also the lifeblood of Pakistan's economy and also the food basket of Pakistan, and also for a lot of other countries where Pakistan exports. And if we go further down to the south, there's the Arabian Sea that meets our coast, and there's also sea level rise and soil erosion over there. So what is happening lately that is being noticed is that the melting of glaciers, the high torrential rains during monsoon season, but also erratic rainfalls because of climate change, the patterns are changing, and that affects the agricultural production timings and the scale and the intensity of the rains. That affects that completely. And increasing desertification and soil erosion in the soil in the south is also making it more vulnerable to climate change. So there are all these different effects that are influencing climate vulnerability of Pakistan. It does not have a uniform geographical terrain.
Do we have insight into factors that have added to climate change that are relatable and measurable in Pakistan at this point?
Yeah, it's very hard to pinpoint a specific year or time period in which climate change impact started showing in Pakistan. But if we look at the average, then the temperature has risen in this region, in South Asia in general, and in Pakistan in particular as well. And that, as I mentioned earlier, that affects crop productivity and the agricultural patterns. In terms of emissions and pollution, Pakistan contributes less than 1% to the global carbon emissions. So we cannot really link Pakistan's own carbon emissions to the changing climate. It's a global phenomena, so climate change doesn't really follow borders like we do. It's not the effect of what Pakistan is doing in terms of using certain fuels or producing carbon emissions that is affecting it. It's mostly agreed upon globally that it's the industrialization processes of other countries due to which Pakistan is experiencing these impacts, and along with other countries as well, like small island states, coastal areas. Bangladesh experiences floods quite often, quite regularly. And these countries do not necessarily have the capacity to deal with the impacts that are not even their own doing.
Subsequently, what is currently the discussion in Pakistan also with regards to this problem?
So there is a great sense of climate injustice among the people of Pakistan. And of course, there are concerns about how responsive the government has been in terms of helping people. But in reality, it needs resources. So as much as we could have done, as much as the government could have done, the disaster this time is so big in scale that it couldn't have been handled, and it is not being handled alone. So the international community does need to play its part. I found recently that the UN has announced a flash appeal for about $160 million to help Pakistan in recovering from the flood impacts. And the European Union has also pledged to provide $1.8 million for relief efforts in Pakistan. And this is all good, and this is very helpful. But I think the initial sense of helping people that is decreasing as this becomes old news and there are more news coming in from across the world about different events. So I think we still need to have a conversation about it and keep this cause on top priority.
If we look at migration now, because as ICMPD we're dealing with migration, what can you say about the connection between migration and climate change? Is this something that you can already observe? Obviously, in Pakistan, it is something that you can see now because of the catastrophe. You have a lot of internally displaced people. So what's the situation now? And what are the estimations how it's going to evolve over the next years?
So the relationship between climate change and migration is quite complicated. Climate change is not just extreme events. It's not just floods. It is much more, and it can come slower as well, that we cannot just pinpoint that this movement is because of climate change. Because, for example, if it's a piece of land that is becoming infertile because of the environment around it, because the temperatures are rising over time, because of the difference in rainfall patterns, the productivity is not as it used to be. For those people who are cropping on those lands, they might find it helpful to migrate as a planned adaptation strategy to the nearest city or to the next big town. And that's what research has shown, that if it's climate-related migration, or if climate is one of the factors that influences migration decisions, mostly people migrate domestically to the urban centers. That's the pattern that is observable. But in these cases, it's very difficult to pinpoint that climate change is the reason behind this migration decision, because it acts as a what they call in the academic community a threat multiplier.
Okay.
So it's not the sole factor that is driving migration.
Right.
In case of floods or other big disasters or extreme events, it's displacement. So it's forced, it's involuntary, people were not planning to move and they had to move because of the sudden catastrophe or crisis that they are experiencing. In those cases as well, it is observed from previous research that it's mostly domestic. And most of the people, they return to the areas they migrated or they were displaced from once the condition is such that they can start living there again. But as we see that these processes or these events are becoming more and more frequent almost every year, there is a concern that at some point these resources there would be pressure on the existing resources. For example, in the recipient communities, in the urban centers. So there might be some ensuing impacts on migrations across the borders, maybe not by the same people who were affected by climate change, but because it is all related and how the resources in host communities are affected. There's pressure on the existing facilities. There's rising inflation generally, high unemployment rates. So all of those effects combined may have linkages to international migration as well. But to date, saying climate change will lead to massive cross-border movement, that is not too clear scientifically.
So to sum it up, first of all, climate change or extreme climate-related events lead to internal migration to urban centers, we can say, more or less. That eventually may lead to resource problems in those centers. That theoretically may then lead to cross-border migration, to understand kind of the linkage there.
Exactly.
But that's a very, very easy way of looking at it, but that's theoretically kind of the mechanism. Okay. Within ICMPD, but I think also outside, as far as I've seen, the research field as such is relatively new. Do you think that this is something that we have to work on more in the future? And is this also something that is actually encouraged and where there is sufficient funding?
So we've seen that this topic has been growing in terms of international policy response, and we can read about it in the IPCC reports on climate change that come out every year, that the human mobility and climate change, they have linkages. But it is very difficult to predict to what extent people would be moving because of climate change, where they would be moving, and depending on whether it is voluntary migration as an adaptation strategy, or if it is involuntary or displacement, the response has to be different. And that is something that we need to start the conversation on and have some solutions prepared to deal with either situation. Because, of course, if migration is a planned strategy and we realize that there are people who can fulfill labor shortages in certain areas, they can be planned accordingly. But when it is extreme events and displacement, it's very hard to predict when it would happen and where people would move. So in those cases, in areas which are becoming inhabitable, it is important that governments can foresee and also help planned relocation. Some researchers have also indicated that maybe development of intermediate cities within the countries is also a helpful response to plan all of this, the relocation to certain areas, because the big cities are already under pressure in certain areas. So there has been this suggestion to start thinking about developing intermediate cities in recipient societies to host people.
Overall, it seems that it's such a interdisciplinary challenge that I think this is what makes it so difficult to tackle, because it really means that the international community has to work together, the individual has to be on board as well. So people have to be educated about climate change and also fight certain forces that are opposing overall the concept of climate change. And then again, as I said, the sort of interdisciplinary collaboration where often people don't really understand each other because they only look at their own discipline. The politicians look at politics, the environmentalists look at the environment, and so on and so forth. And that makes it quite difficult. And then all of this at an international level. But I think there are at least already some small changes happening now. We see that some politicians have really put it on their agenda. We do have the Paris Agreement. Pakistan has a Ministry of Climate Change, which I find also quite interesting. So coming back to Pakistan, can this catastrophe, based on its severity, based on how large it is, based on the crazy numbers that you have mentioned earlier, in terms of the affected population, in terms of how much money and time will be needed for reconstruction, and based on the fact that suffering is still ongoing, based on all of this, can this catastrophe serve as a wake-up call for the international community? And what would be required now, or what is required now, that the international community really starts taking action?
Definitely. This event is a very loud wake-up call for the whole world, the international community, because, as I said earlier, climate change impacts, they don't know any borders. It's Pakistan today. There are floods in Puerto Rico, I think. As we speak right now, there are floods in other countries as well, and floods are not just the sole impact of climate change. There are droughts and famine expected in Africa. So I don't think that the international community can just close their eyes to these crises happening across the world. It's very important to come together and to also realize the commitments all the countries have made in the Paris Agreement, in these international commitments. There is a pathway that the countries have agreed on. There are targets that countries have pledged to meet. There needs to be implementation on those targets now, and I think these events like these can be a driver of more commitment or more action on those targets that are already prescribed. The impact of climate change are not just limited to the global south, even though the countries in the global south are experiencing the impacts much worse today. But as we know that this whole process is just starting, and we are expecting more severe impacts in the coming years. So it's time that countries in the global south and north, they all take it seriously.
That's very well said. And with this, dear Ayesha, I think we got a really, really good insight into this entire complex of migration, displacement, also on the situation in Pakistan, of course. Once again, thank you very much.
Thank you.
To our listeners, thank you very much for being with us today. Please subscribe to our podcast, follow our social media. Thank you very much for listening, and see you next time. Stay up to date on ICMPD's activities and visit our website icmpd.org, sign up for our newsletter and follow us on social media.